Welcome back to Wealth Witches. I'm your host, Katelyn Magnuson, and we have a guest with us today, John De Goey, and I am very excited to be chatting with him today, especially with the timing of all of this and the world as it is right now. So, John, welcome. I'd love for you to give a little bit more info about yourself.
Thank you for having me, Caitlin. So I'm a portfolio manager in Toronto, Canada, and I've been doing what I do for over 30 years. I have a podcast of my own called Make Better Wealth Decisions, and I have written three books, one of which is over my shoulder there called Bullshift. That's with an F, Bullshift. The subtitle is How Optimism Bias Threatens Your Finances, and it talks about how there's a lot of risk in the way financial services industry gets people thinking about how to think. And a lot of that is just based on the sales imperative rather than giving good advice.
I think that's really important to be talking about. I think so many times we're not necessarily aware of our bias to begin with. So I know you and I were chatting before this that the timing of this couldn't have really been better right now. So with what is going on in the world and the economy right now, I know I've been fielding a lot of questions, a lot of anxiety, a lot of, what should I be doing here? So I'm sure you've been fielding plenty of that yourself. Where would you even start if you were trying to, talk to or educate someone that was worried about the economy and the markets and their, retirement that they were getting started on?
Talking about, Caitlin, is there something going on in the world?
No,
Really?
nothing at all. Everything's status quo. It's very calm.
Okay, so all the advice that you normally hear, stay calm, take a long-term view, that advice is a bit trite and a bit motherhood, and you hear it all the time. It is certainly correct in terms of what you should do, but it might be a bit naive in terms of what people actually do. So you can tell someone that you want to lose weight, sure, just diet and exercise, get some good sleep. Sure. Knowing what to do and doing it are different things. So the saying that I always like to use is the difference between theory and practice is that in theory, there is no difference, but in practice, there is. So when you tell people to stay calm and to not panic with regard to massive uncertainty, they will understand what you're saying intellectually, and they will know that what you're saying is sensible and true. But that's not going to calm them down. In fact, if they see the news or watch TV or go online and see what's going on in social media, they will be inundated with a lot of ever changing bits of information, oftentimes conflicting information, and a lot of it is exceedingly unsettling. So it then becomes a question of, I know I'm supposed to be calm, but the first thing that I would say is you need to know yourself. And if you know yourself and you know that you can stay calm, then stay calm and carry on. If, however, you think you're the sort of person who's given what has gone on, maybe if you think of the way you reacted during the global financial crisis or other things, or even during the COVID crisis, which was over in 5 weeks. But whatever it is, if you in the past have a history of bailing, maybe you should preemptively make some changes to your portfolio before things get worse and then you feel you want to bail after they've gotten worse. So I don't know, everyone's different, but I am going to put it out there that you should think about who you yourself are and act accordingly based on your own past experiences and your own emotional response.
Okay. I think that's very sound wisdom. What makes the time period that we're going through right now different when compared to, so I came of age right during the 2008. I was graduating high school, I was in college, I was in the workforce, I was working three jobs, and I remember watching my parents, go through some tumultuous times, and millennials that are a little bit older than myself are like, oh, this is the third economic crisis we've been through, in our adult lives. What makes this different, or is it different than the last couple that we've seen, COVID, 2008, and so on?
What makes it different is that it's not only an economic crisis, but also potentially a political crisis. And that's a bit beyond the purview of what you and I normally talk about, but that is the answer to your question. With regard to other economic crises that we've had in the past, the similarity is that it's unpredictable. when people were, I remember in late 2008, people were talking about, will banks fail? What's going to happen? And is Hank Paulson going to be able to save the system and too big to fail and all those things? There was a great deal of uncertainty as to the limits of how far things could go and how much worse things could get. Now, I don't think we're anywhere close to that yet, but I also don't think we're anywhere close to being through this crisis yet either. So that's why I said what I said a few minutes ago. If you think
Hmm.
if it's going to get worse and you think you're not going to be able to handle it, how about if you get out before it gets really bad? That's not necessarily a forecast that it will get bad, but it's certainly a recognition that it could. And then
Right.
you just have to know yourself. So what is different is the nature of the uncertainty. Previous uncertainty was, well, what do we do about counterparty risk with regard to the financial crisis? What do we do about the ability to have everyone be sent home from work and be able to deal with an economic crisis as well as a health crisis with COVID 5 years ago? So this is now the same in that it's a crisis of unknown economic consequences. But this time, the sort of other half of the equation is the political backdrop in terms of what it's going to mean, the realignment of the global system, not only for trade, but also for geopolitics, for alliances and commitments. So the subplot, let's say, is different. The plot of global uncertainty in economic times is the same throughout all of those. What is different is the subplot that accompanies it.
I think that's what gives me the most pause is there's such a difference on the political spectrum, I feel like, for what we're going through right now that adds truly like an element of chaos and unknown to it that I feel like we haven't necessarily experienced, at least in my adulthood. So it definitely,
Yep.
I think, can make everyone feel uncertain, especially, and again, not just for this set time period, but also the US has been such a standard for so long in having the dollar and all these other things that we've been looking at, and I feel that we are watching that change right before our eyes. And what does that mean for the long term future of us, of global trade, global economies? If you were to be talking to someone that was in their 30s right now and is they've been investing, they've been, working on building this. They have a while until retirement, if retirement's ever going to exist, because who knows that, yeah, at this point in time, right? I think a lot of the traditional advice, so to speak, or information that pops up comes along the lines of, just dollar cost. Like you're just putting in the same amount every month consistently, and you're just trucking along through good and through bad. I'm going to make an assumption and be very available for correction that it kind of depends on someone's individual personal financial situation, whether they should continue doing what they've been doing. But I'd love to hear your information or thoughts on what someone should be doing right now if they've been, just ticking along.
So certainly, if you have been dollar cost averaging and you're putting a little bit of money away every month or every pay or what have you, by all means, a lot of being successful as an investor is behavioral in terms of just having the good habit. And if you can get into the routine of being a regular investor or a regular saver or a person who sets money aside every time they get paid, that of and by itself is a very strong indicator that you'll be successful down the road. Now, the other thing that I would say is we've already talked about know yourself and whether or not you can handle it. If you're young and your job is secure, and I think that's an important caveat because obviously you need to be careful depending on what happens if the economy changes. If you're an auto worker, for instance, your job might be in jeopardy and you might want to, some of that money that you're saving, you might want to save, but instead of putting it into an investment account, you put it into an emergency fund in order to protect yourself if you lose your position. But assuming that your job is secure, you can then think about the way you react psychologically. On the one hand, if you're investing, pick a number, $500 a month, and that $500 a month goes into a series of a basket of two or three different mutual funds or exchange traded funds or what have you, and these are things that are going to be more volatile. You can say, well, I'm buying the dip and this asset class is on sale and I'm buying more for the next 6 months or 12 months or however long it is until the market hits a bottom and starts coming back up. That's an entirely valid thing. And if in fact you're relatively young and therefore have a relatively small nest egg and have a lot of runway ahead of you, that's probably what you should be doing. As you get older, and this is not exactly what you asked me, Caitlin, but I'm gonna make sure that I make a distinction. If you get a little bit older, but you're still working, let's say you're now mid-career, you're in your mid 50s, early 50s,
Mhm.
you can still put that money aside and you should still continue to do that, but maybe you can put the money into things that are maybe a little more conservative. other alternative asset classes so that the pain of buying things when they're down and of course or repositioning what you already have is not as severe. I'm not saying you have to do anything, but I'm going to come back to what I said I think two or three times now. You need to know yourself, and I can't give one size fits all advice
Right.
because different people will react differently to the same circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's really important to be aware of. And I think we're seeing people that didn't know how they would react potentially until
Right.
maybe they're finding out now. So, is there anything else on this front? Because I don't want to spend the whole time on where we are right now, although it feels very big, bold, and in our faces. But is there anything else that you'd really like anyone that's listening to know as they're trudging forward through what today looks like?
We always get through it, but what it is never known. And part of what makes it difficult to get through whatever it is you're getting through is that fear of the unknown and assuming the worst. Now, sometimes, if we were to look at how people coped in the 1930s
Mhm.
with the Great Depression, I would argue that the trite, platitudinal, oh, don't worry, this will be fine sort of advice was probably the wrong advice. And ironically, as you would know as a student of history, it was the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930 that exacerbated the problems associated with the Great Depression. And so there are some similarities between what's happening now and what happened in the 1930s. I actually think there are a lot of similarities going on to what's going on now and what happened in the 1970s when we
Okay.
had what's called stagflation. I think
Mhm.
actually in many ways the 1974 to 1979 sort of markets going sideways and inflation being into double digits and the economy not growing is very much like what we are probably going to be in for as we try to transition this economy. And there's no guarantee that it will be successful or not. But at any rate, I think just making the attempt to do this transition will be painful in the interim at a minimum. So I think you need to, again, you might want to be, for some people, it's comforting to be a student of history. For others, it just adds to their anxiety. But again, you do whatever works for you.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's really important. I appreciate all of that. I would really like to spend some time talking about what you cover in your book,
Yeah,
Bullshift, and going over the header on it is how optimism bias threatens your finances. Can you
sure.
explain to anyone that's listening what optimism bias is?
Sure. I was hoping you'd ask me that. That's the wonderful thing. So first off, everyone's biased. Every single person on the planet is biased. If you know who Daniel Kahneman is, he wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. It was a New York Times bestseller 10 or 12 years ago. He's a Nobel Prize winner. He just died last year, but he's probably the granddaddy, the godfather of behavioral economics. And he's the person that brought behavioral decision making into the mainstream. Whereas up until then, economics was just sort of supply and demand and charts and graphs, and it was all presumptive that people made self-interested, rational decisions. And what Kahneman showed was that people, in fact, make emotional decisions that are not at all rational. So, with that as the backdrop, to answer your question, optimism bias is something that virtually everyone suffers from. And it is the view that even as you accept that bad things will happen, you reject the notion that they're likely to happen to you. So here's an example. The classic example is divorce. I don't know if you know what the percentages are, but I'll tell you that in the Western world, in Canada, the US, and Western Europe, the divorce rates are somewhere between 40 and 50%. But if you ask a couple on their wedding day, what are the odds that you're going to divorce? And you say, oh, and by the way, do you know the odds? Many of them will know that the odds are 40 to 50%. But even if you told them, 40 to 50% of all marriages end in divorce, what are the odds that you two are going to divorce? You know what? Pretty much 100% will say, not me. It happens. I understand. I can't explain these stupid idiots who get married and end up getting divorced down the road. Like I imagine, like what's going on? And then, of course, a few years down the road, 40 or 50% of them are divorced too. So they know what the evidence is. They know that it's an ex post sort of thing where after the fact that that's what it is, but ex ante, not knowing what your own personal future holds, you will say, well, it's not going to happen to me. And then, of course, it does. So this is a risk that we all need to confront because we all assume that we're special or lucky, like you can do whatever else. So when we have a stock market that is uncertain, like we
Mhm.
have today, like we're talking about, you've got to think about first off if I've seen studies just in the past month and a half. Well, people will say, "Do you think we're heading into a recession?" And people will say 65% will say, "Yes, I think we are." And then, "Do you think you will be affected?" And only 40% think they will be. Okay, well, wait a minute. If you just told me 10 seconds ago that you know that we're going to be in a recession, but somehow you think that despite that, you're
You're gonna be
somehow not going to be
unscathed.
affected
Yeah.
by it. It's just not sensible. But it's human nature. We all do it, or virtually everyone does it. And certainly the thing that you need to think about with regard to your portfolio is every single time you need to stop, maybe have a buddy, a spouse, a friend from school, a friend at work, someone, I don't care, from your softball team, from your beer league, from church. I don't care where you've got a friend, but sit down and talk to that person that will tell you the straight goods and say, so am I biased? Do I think about things honestly and fairly?
Mhm.
And try to honestly hold yourself to account for the way you make decisions, because a lot of people make decisions out of self-interest and they're emotional, and then they justify them. They will find something that they will say is rational to justify having made that decision after the fact, but that decision was not made using rationality. The decision was made using emotion, and it was
Right.
justified using the way you feel, and the way you want people to perceive you. That's really important when you're making decisions about your investing, because it's your life savings at stake, and people don't like to admit how emotional they are.
I think it's very easy, especially when money comes into play, to one, be very emotional about our decisions that we make, but to also try to rationalize them truly as whatever it is at the time. Like I've seen people that gamble or will
Yeah.
risk money in ways, and there's always a way to justify it. And I'm not here to, poo-poo gambling. I always joke that I gamble with my life choices because I'm an entrepreneur over, gambling with money at a casino. But it's all about our risk tolerance on that side of it. So when it comes to optimism bias, how are we seeing that show up in a day-to-day person's life when it comes to their, they're investing their finances? Is this looking more like they're taking risks because they think they can understand that the risk is there, but it's not going to happen to them? What are the odds of it? They don't think they'll be impacted.
Yeah. So a lot of it comes down to rationalization. And one of my favorite sayings is, people who rationalize tell rational lies. It seems plausible on the surface, but it's not actually true. When you think about, let's say we have a market downturn, let's just think about COVID. This is something that the people that are listening to your podcast will probably remember because it's in the recent past and there's a recency bias. So I'll talk a little bit about recency bias, but I'll also talk about decision making. So recency bias is when you think that whatever you make a decision based on what happened recently, and you assume that what will happen in the future will replicate or rhyme with or be very similar to what happened in the past, because that's the easiest for you to recall. And so that recency bias will inform your decision making. Whereas if that event, in this case, what the market did during COVID, hadn't happened, the decision you might make going forward might be different. But the decision you make is informed by what you experienced and how you reacted last time, because you think that, well, maybe the future will be the same. Now, the future is, what's the saying? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. So what will happen next time will never be exactly the same, but there will be certain similarities. And as I say, there's the global uncertainty, the economic uncertainty, but then is it a health crisis? Is it a credit crisis? Is it a political crisis? The subtext is always a bit different. When you think about optimism bias, it's one of those things where people will say the market might drop, and for some reason, people will think, even if pick a number, the S&P drops by 25%, I understand that the S&P 500 will drop by 25%, or that it has and that it might. But for whatever reason, you think, but my portfolio won't. Well, wait a minute. You're buying an ETF that tracks the S&P 500. If the S&P 500 drops 25%, what do you think is going to happen to your portfolio? Of course, you're going to experience the same thing. People, for whatever reason, can't get their head around, oh, this is not some generic thing that happens in general. It happens to everyone who's invested in this. And oh, by the way, I'm invested in this. So what's going to happen to me? People, for some reason, it doesn't compute. They don't process it. Or if they understand it intellectually, but they don't do the first derivative exercise of how am I going to react and how am I going to change my behavior emotionally as a result of this happening. And it's that failure to be reflective, to be honest with yourself, and to preemptively make changes if need be that gets people into trouble.
Okay. So if you're trying to combat this and you're sitting down and you've had sort of the first discussion with your friend or your spouse or whomever, as you alluded to earlier, hey, am I biased? But am I thinking about this the right way? Where am I coming out with this? And you are able to, pattern interrupt. I've talked about this before with other guests, but essentially you pattern interrupt and then you can start making changes once you've noticed that there is a pattern that's occurring. What does the next set of steps look like if you figured out like, okay, I have this, optimism bias, it's potentially impacting the decisions that I'm making? Where would someone go from there?
If you are serious about the mistakes you've made in the past and you sort of want to apologize to yourself for having made these mistakes, the sincerest apology is change behavior. It doesn't matter what it is. If you've got, an abusive spouse, if you've got an alcoholic in the family, whatever else, they can tell you they're sorry. But if they keep on doing the same thing they've always done, it calls into question whether or not they are genuinely sorry. So if you have a history of overreacting or reacting poorly or doing things that for whatever reason you would then deem that a reasonable person would deem to be involving some form of self-harm, you need to be able to identify the problem and resolve here and now to proactively nip that in the bud, change the way you do things so that it doesn't happen in the future. Easier said than done. And it's usually just like if you're working out at the gym, it's usually good to have a workout buddy or someone who will hold you accountable.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying you can't do it yourself, but I am saying it is more likely that you will be successful if you've got someone who you care about, who cares about you, who will say, "Hey, Katelyn, you said you would never do that again, and here you are doing it again. We got to talk about that."
Right. Okay. I think that sounds really good. I mean, it sounds good in practice, right? But I think implementing and building that habit and being able to do all of it
Theory and
is,
practice. The
yes,
difference between
yes,
theory and practice is that in theory, there's no difference. Show
yep.
me you can actually do it in practice, though.
Yeah, no, I think that that's really valuable information to have. So what else? I know before we started recording, we were talking about other, biases that may pop up. What else are you seeing when it comes to, habits or thoughts and, routines that people
Sure.
have when it comes to their money, when it comes to investing, when it comes to their beliefs?
Let's talk about something because we did talk a little bit about political views as well.
Yeah.
The one bias that I think is very easy to illustrate both for politics and for investing is confirmation bias. So, confirmation bias is where you say you're trying to do your own research and trying to get to the facts, but you're not, in fact, looking for evidence that's dispassionate and accurate at all. What you're doing is you're looking for evidence that confirms your pre existing beliefs so that you can justify doing what you always wanted to do in the first place. So confirmation bias exists in politics and in social settings and in economics and investing and in all manner of things. And it's very natural. And that would be maybe confirmation bias would be maybe the best way to talk to someone to actually have them hold you accountable because you can maybe even write down your views about what do you think about X
Hmm.
and then have your friend say, "This is what I think you think about X," and then compare what your friend would say about you compared to what you would say about you, and it could be a fun little drinking game. Like, you can go out to a pub on a Friday night and just sort of say, "Hey, just wanted to see this thing here. Here's what I think about you. What do you think about me about this?" Just to see, it's a wonderful way to engage in self exploration and self discovery. And that has applications not only for investing in politics, but
Hmm.
also for your life with a life partner, your decisions if you have children, a whole manner, or the other way around for your parents in terms of the way you interact with them, because everyone brings their life history and their experiences with them. And it's worthwhile to explore, well, why do I think that? And is that really right? Does the way I was raised jive with what I believe now? What has changed? Why? What am I going to do differently?
As someone that has done a lot of that, yes, yes to all of it. I think that those are really valuable practices to put in place because I think so many times I know I ended up in my mid 20s realizing that I was parroting ideals that I didn't actually align with any longer, but had just been how you were raised or how what you were surrounded with and the environment that you grew up in. So being able to take a step back and really analytically assess, does that actually represent who I am or who I want to be now? And if not, being able to make changes aligned with that.
So I think that exercise is especially useful for people in their very late teens to their very early 30s. There's a 10 or 12-year window when you grow up and you determine who you really are. So
Mhm.
the exercise is useful at any point in life, but I think it's especially useful for people that are at that stage.
I would agree wholeheartedly with my own experience through those ages that that is a really transitional time, a really
Yeah.
important transitional time, especially as you're getting your feet underneath you and figuring out where you sit in the world. So, what do you want to talk about next?
Well, I'd like to talk about biases in general.
Yeah.
So maybe I could take a moment to tell you a little bit about all of you. First off, there are maybe a few hundred biases, so I
Yes.
can't cover them all. But let's see if we can talk about other sort of heuristics. Heuristics are rules of thumb, a way that we make
Okay.
decisions that are based on the way we experience things. And sometimes the research shows that this goes all the way back to like caveman times. So, one of the reasons why people have a hard time being successful investors is that our brains have been hardwired since antiquity to make decisions because once upon a time it was a life and death decision about what am I going to do if I'm being chased by a saber-toothed cat.
Right.
And literally it goes back, millennia, and decisions were made and they needed to be made very quickly. And to use the example, Daniel Kahneman in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, that's the distinction that you need to think about is that most people most of the time make fast decisions and most of the time those decisions are fine. But if you need to stop and do brain hurting work to actually think, you can't make a quick decision. You need to read the manual. You need to figure out
Hmm.
how to do things. First off, humans are uniquely qualified to do that in the universe because other species can't do it. But it's not natural for us because we've spent up until the past maybe couple hundred years
Hmm.
making decisions on a snap basis, and now we need to be more contemplative. So the first thing is be mindful of making decisions, and if it's an important life decision, don't just wing it. You need to stop and reflect and do an inventory of what am I trying to accomplish here, what could go wrong. You could do actually what could go wrong is a really good way to make decisions. One of the things that Kahneman talks about is doing a pre-mortem. So if you ever watch a TV show, oftentimes they'll have a coroner and they'll do a post-mortem to figure
Hmm.
out why did Mrs. Jones die? It seems suspicious and everything else. So that's the post-mortem, and they get the coroner in to figure out what the causation was, the time of death, why, how, yada yada. A pre-mortem is when you do the thought exercise of thinking about what could go wrong. This is true if you're starting a small business. This is true if you're contemplating marriage. This is true if you're thinking of an investment. What could go wrong? Make a list and think about what could go wrong. Research actually shows that people make better decisions when they actively think about what could go wrong because their decisions involve guarding against making dumb mistakes. So doing a pre-mortem is a good way to make decisions and to think about things. And that then brings me to another thing that Kahneman and Tversky, his research partner, came up with, which is something called prospect theory. And prospect theory is another word for loss aversion, specifically loss aversion.
Okay.
So what they showed was the pain of a loss is experienced as being twice as acute as the joy of a gain. So if you know that in advance, instead of thinking about the millions you're going to make if this thing goes to the moon, think of how you might lose a large portion of what you've put up in the first place if it goes to the sewer. Yeah, you would be very happy if it doubled. Well, what if it was cut in half and the move was of a similar magnitude but in the opposite direction?
Hmm.
And then what would that mean for your retirement? Or you can still retire but you've got to work an extra 3 years or what have you. Those are the sorts of questions that might cause you to say, hey, let's pump the brakes here and maybe think about doing something a little bit different because and I'm not saying don't be optimistic, and that's one of the things that I would say about myself and about the book. A lot of people think that maybe John is a pessimist. No, I'm an optimist. I believe in the future. I'm not railing against optimism, I'm warning people about the risk of optimism bias. And optimism bias is not necessarily the same as optimism. It can be, but I think in many cases the things are very different. So those are
Mhm.
the sorts of things that I would use as examples, Caitlin.
Okay. It was very interesting to me because when I was thinking about the 2008, I'd done some reading when that financial collapse had occurred, and everyone, so many people had pulled their funds out of it, and they'd realized all of these losses. And the traditional financial advice that has popped up has been, just hang on to it, hold on to it, don't check your funds, let it just sit there, especially if you have time, just let it sit there, it recovers. And I'd heard what you had said his partner had said about the psychological loss, hurting significantly more. And I
Yeah.
didn't know where that, I could not remember where it had come from. So I'm really glad that you brought that up because that's something that I've
Daniel
had in the
Kahneman.
back
So
of my mind.
yeah, look it up. So Kahneman and Tversky, Kahneman. Kahneman is Daniel Kahneman, and his research partner is Amos Tversky, Tversky. And they wrote the seminal paper on prospect theory. And Tversky died early in life, but Kahneman still ended up getting a Nobel Prize for the research they did together. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really important to be able to understand because I think so many people, as part of their, financial hygiene or, routines that they'll set up, want to hop in and check their investments every day. They check their bank account, they check their investments, they check. And when you have market volatility, I think that that's something to really be keeping in mind because if you're in it for the long haul and you're hopping in and
Yeah.
checking it every day, that can really be, I mean, the news is bad enough, but that can really be this roller coaster of just, emotions.
And if you change your mindset, like if you're in your 30s and you're not going to retire till you're in your 60s, you could be cheering. You should be thankful that the markets are on sale because you're buying more units. I think Warren Buffett used to say, if you eat hamburgers every day and you know you're going to be buying hamburgers again tomorrow and the day after, and the price of hamburgers drops, why would you be upset about that? If you can buy more hamburger or you can
Right.
eat more hamburgers, but at any rate, it's you need to realize that what you're doing is you're accumulating a pool of capital that will appreciate over a long period of time. It's the tragedy of the horizon. People can't look beyond. They anchor their portfolio and they say, I had $100,000 to start the year and now I'm down to $90,000 and I feel like crap. Well, yeah, but if you've been putting in $500 a month for the past 4 months, that $2,000 that you've put in so far in 2025 bought you a heck of a lot more than it would have bought you if you were putting
Right.
that money in at the end of 2024. And since you're not retiring in 2025 or 2035 or 2045, what do you care? You should be happy.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good way to reframe it for people that are stressed about the volatility.
Yeah.
Any other biases that you want to talk about? Because I think this has been absolutely fantastic and incredibly valuable for everyone that's listening. I know that this has been a very relatable conversation that has been going on in our friend group, in our client group. Just, where are we? What are we doing? How is this different? Because we're trying to put it into, we're trying to compare it to past experiences that we've had. We're trying to compare it to COVID. We're trying to compare it to, 2008. We're trying to just get our bearings and figure out and be able to make educated decisions. And I think that this information that you provided is really helpful. I do know that we're going to link both your book and your podcast in the notes that if people want to come and learn more and get more information. But where else can people find you? Are you present on social media, LinkedIn?
I'm on LinkedIn. So John De Goey, it's spelled DE space GOEY, capital G. I have a website, which is johndegoey.ca. And my podcast, as you mentioned, is Make Better Wealth Decisions. It's available on all major platforms. I've written 3 books. Bullshift is just the most recent book, but I've also written a book called The Professional Financial Advisor and another book called Stand Up to the Financial Services Industry. The thing about me is that I don't mind being a bit iconoclastic. So I don't mind challenging orthodoxy. And that doesn't mean that I'm not trying to stir the pot, but I also don't like it when people are less than honest and forthcoming about the risks and limitations of what can and cannot be done and are not really trying to solve the problem. So my concern, I wrote Bullshift a couple of years ago
Mm-hmm.
because what's happening now in capital markets in 2025, when you think about how high, let's say the S&P 500 was
Mm-hmm.
trading, so the CAPE ratio, I don't know if you're familiar with the cyclically adjusted price earnings ratio of the S&P 500, but it was trading in the mid to high 30s for most of the 2020s. Now, the historical CAPE ratio for the S&P 500 is in the high teens, which is to say the CAPE ratio was at about twice, the stock market was twice as expensive in the past half dozen years as it has
Mhm.
been throughout recorded history. To put that in perspective, in 1929, when the stock market crashed, the cyclically adjusted price earnings ratio on the S&P 500 was 30. It's down to about 33 now, but a few months ago it was at 38. But at
Wow.
any rate, throughout the past 5 or 6 years, it has spent that entire time higher than it was before it crashed in 1929.
Hmm.
So that's a risky market. And I wrote the book not knowing, what would happen. It's not about having a forecast. It's not about a crystal ball. I don't know what's going to happen. It's not about knowing what the economy is going to do and what capital markets are going to do. It is warning people to be aware of their own biases so that whenever it happens, why ever it happens, people can understand what's going on and maybe take steps if it's at all possible.
Absolutely. I think the educational and informational piece is really important for the average person, the average layperson that
Yeah.
isn't, in this day to day. So I think this is incredibly beneficial. Thank you so much, John.
My pleasure, Caitlin. It's been a real pleasure for me as well.
It really has. Thank you.
That's a wrap for this episode of the Wealth Witches podcast. I hope our magical money talks have left you feeling empowered and inspired. Remember, wealth isn't just about dollars in the bank, it's about abundance and financial freedom in all aspects of your life. I'm Katelyn Magnuson, encouraging you to keep challenging the status quo and embrace your inner witch on this financial journey. Until next time, stay magical.